Well, joining me now in the studio is independent economist Clifford Bennett. Clifford, we just heard a little bit of the Q&A there around whether the government or the Treasurer, or the RBA Governor are at war. Are they at war?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't call it guerrilla warfare, would you? Because it's pretty out in the open. So I'd categorise it as a significant war, yes, because I think I feel sorry for the Treasurer. He had that opportunity, and there was talk that he was going to appoint a new Treasurer, new Governor of the RBA from outside the bank, which is something I've championed for over a decade. And then suddenly at the last moment, he's promoted the deputy expecting a different outcome. So, of course, that's his error, and I actually feel for him now. Look, some of the comments there by the governor, I mean, she's trying to do a job. The RBA does a lot of great work in a lot of areas. One thing it failed on for many years now is monetary policy. So you'd have to say that it is a failed institution when it comes to monetary policy. And I would suggest that the current governor is perpetuating the culture that created that sad state of affairs for the Reserve Bank. You've got to remember, it's the only central bank in the OECD ever felt it needed to do an urgent report review suggestion to the Federal Treasurer on. So we're not talking about one of the world's sharpest central banks. And when she comes out and says things like you have to choose between inflation and a recession, and when she talks about other governments focusing on the cost of living for their constituents, does she miss the point? And I think the RBA does, that raising interest rates in this current economic environment, domestically, globally, does not stop inflation.
How do we stop it then?
I mean, but I'll just quickly come back, right? They're using a 1960s textbook, which was that inflation only came from overheating economies, which is why she made a suggestion a week or two ago that the Australian economy was still overheating. Well, we all know that's not true, and yet she's the governor of the RBA and seems to have had no clue with the GDP data that we just saw, which is all about government spending, private sector's totally stalling out, and she's still talking, sorry, shouldn't say that, the governor's still talking about raising rates to stop inflation. It's one of the world's smallest little banks down here in Australia, and so raising rates here does not stop inflationary pressures that build from geopolitical tensions and other factors. Yes, inflation was partly driven in Australia by, I think we all accept now, some degree of price gouging by retailers, particularly in the grocery sector. But being aware of that is yet another argument for why we shouldn't be raising rates. My catchphrase really is, raising rates now adds to the pain on businesses and consumers and families. It doesn't solve any problem at all. It just increases the pain. And you would think that the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia would understand these things.
Yeah, well, she did acknowledge today that interest rates she knows a lot of people out there are hurting and are struggling under those 13 rate rises that they've been hit with since 2022. So she acknowledged that, but obviously she did say, she'd kind of leave the door open to raising rates again. So
yes,
do you think the cash rate needs to be cut?
Personally wants to raise rates. I don't mean it from a personal point of view, but her herself from an economic viewpoint.
Because other central banks have obviously lifted rates a lot more aggressively than Australia.
Yes, and I mean, it's their second mistake. Their biggest mistake was leaving rates near zero coming out of COVID when the economy was booming and still had rates at zero. So we accentuated that roller coaster boom, and now we're having an accentuated slowdown. I mean, there's no growth, private sector growth in the economy. So inflation is not coming from an overheating economy. It's not coming from that. You use higher rates to dampen economic growth. We don't need economic growth dampened, so that's not the cause of inflation. It's blatantly clear. And to raise rates is entirely counterproductive and probably adds to inflation.
Well, yeah, the GDP numbers came out yesterday. You mentioned government spending being one of the big things keeping the economy ticking over in the June quarter. Michele Bullock was asked about government spending and whether it's a problem. Let's just have a listen.
Look, I've said a number of times in the past, and I've said it to the Parliament as well, government spending is not actually the main game here. I think, as we saw in the national accounts yesterday, consumption is really weak. Now, we are looking for a recovery in consumption, but if that doesn't occur, then that's actually going to be a really important piece of information, and it's also going to be really important for the inflation outcomes. So I think basically we should be focusing on the breadth of what's happening in the economy, demand as in total demand and not focusing on individual components.
So, in one hand, you've got the government increasing its spending. On the other hand, you've got the Reserve Bank trying to stop consumers from spending. So it's a bit of a challenge.
But the governor just mentioned that consumers aren't spending. Well, she was wondering about what's going to happen there. Well, I've got that information for her. Most economists in Australia do have that information already to hand over to the governor. Consumers are in trouble. It's slowing. Aggregate data is disguising how the big end of town is still spending, but most Australians are totally struggling. We shouldn't be looking at aggregate data. And what maddens me, to be honest, because we should be looking after our society, is that the Governor of the Reserve Bank just then said we shouldn't be looking at individual parts of the economy, just the overall number. Why is that too hard for the RBA? They've got 400 economists or whatever it is. Is it too hard for them to look at the individual components? Of course they matter. For a Governor of the Reserve Bank to say that is a little bit outrageous, to be honest. So I'm probably being a little bit outrageous as well. Yeah. But, you know, this is below par central bank performance by international standards. And I think we have to we might see another one-term governor.
Clifford Bennett, thanks for coming on the show. We're out of time.